Right, so before we start, sorry, I've already ranted on for rather a long time, but as you know, the title of this series is Conversations, and we really do intend for this to be a conversation between our panelists, me as the chair, and with you. But the way that we do this is we use a rolling Q&A. So for those of you who are joining us online this evening, please put any questions as they occur to you into the Q&A. I will be monitoring that and I will feed them into the conversation. We found that this really works very, very well. It helps to keep the conversations lively. So I'll be integrating them as we go along. Another piece of housekeeping, sorry about this, I know this annoys everybody, but we put a link to our event feedback into the chat. Please do take some time to fill this in towards the end, because it's really helpful for us to hear your thoughts so that we can continue to develop this format and to continue to run events like this one. But now I think that's me done with for now. I'll just sit back. No, I won't just sit back and enjoy the conversation. But I think we should start the conversation. So welcome to you all. I hope that you enjoy the conversation this evening. The first topic that we're going to touch on this evening is to do with narratives, because of course we're in a period, and we have been for a very long time actually, where there are some particularly prominent narratives about immigration circulating in the public and political domain. And I think one of the challenges that we all face in our work as scholars, in our work as activists, is about how these have become presented as kind of legitimate concerns or common sense. So I'm thinking of things like the presentation of those seeking new lives by crossing the channel in small boats as illegal immigrants. Fizza, I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on this idea of legitimate concerns and what work that's doing.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I mean, we've heard the words or the phrase legitimate concerns bandied around a lot. And I mean, it really came up quite significantly in the racist riots of last year, where you suddenly had mainstream media saying, oh, well, these are just protesters with legitimate concerns about migration. And you saw this in relation to them, lynch mobs out in the street who were going after anyone who was Black or brown. And to, I guess, like dilute what is racist and anti-migrant sentiments and narratives is just, it's passive, it's acceptable, and it doesn't, it's exclusive of racism. Like there's nothing of that in here. This is just concerns people hold, I think is something incredibly wrong at the moment. And it's basically like normalizing this idea that people can have concerns about migration without really understanding what those concerns are. And I think when a lot of people do go and say, well, what are the issues that you are worried about? And they're saying, well, it's health access, it's the NHS, I can't get to my GP, can't get a house, I can't get this. And it's like, but those aren't because of migration, those are because of poor policy decisions by current and previous governments. And so I think this idea that the legitimate concerns about migration is just basically normalizing what we would say is thinly veiled racism. And it's just kind of leaving people with this idea that to have concerns about migration, it's okay. And that's normal, it's acceptable. And I think there just needs to be some kind of pushback against that actually when you go down to it, I mean, people didn't seem to have an issue with Ukrainians coming in. Let's just say that. And they've come in rightly. We've given them the kind of the space and the access to come and flee to safety. But as soon as you start talking about people crossing in the boats, then there's legitimate concerns about migration. And it's because they're usually men, they're Black and brown men, Muslim majority countries. So there's like this, yeah, it's all veiled in racism, we would say.
Alex, I think that's a really good place to bring you in, because you've worked quite a bit on the crossings and the kind of vilification of crossings, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here. So perhaps as a little bit of a background in terms of the research that I've done. So between 2020 and 23, I worked on a project that engaged with mobilization against immigration, where my colleague Maddie Clark and I basically monitored social media activities of people who've developed a public profile in speaking out against immigration, quite literally. So anybody who's famously talking about immigration as a problem, we had on our radar over this course of 3 years, but we also interviewed people who were sort of prominent actors in this field. And we didn't want to limit that to far-right agitators who were also among those people who we did interview, but we also spoke to representatives of mainstream parties, Labour, the Conservatives, and anyone who sort of basically made a career in speaking out against immigration, which is a sort of specific discourse that has become very influential in the UK, we engaged with in one way or another. And I think we're in a sort of distinctive juncture where immigration has become a topic that no political party in the British landscape until most recently has dared to speak positively about, which I think is something that has happened since basically since the run-up to the referendum. It's become almost impossible to relate to immigration, the benefits of immigration. And I think there's a real tension between how immigration is framed as a problem across the board in response to, you know, far-right parties that are pushing this agenda, the way in which mainstream parties are appropriating this and then jumping in on the bandwagon and contribute to framing this as a problem is absolutely in disproportionate tension to what they're actually doing. Because we know that the Tories, so the Conservative Party, became almost indistinguishable in some of its statements from things that we're now hearing from Reform. And there's a sort of almost a spectral positioning towards the politics of immigration. Yet we had the highest net migration, which is one of these, you know, buzzwords as well, invited by the Conservative government, because there's a clear understanding that Britain, in its current shape and size, as, you know, a leading West European country with, you know, an accelerated form of capitalism, heavily relies on migrant labor. And I think we're in this sort of impasse right now where academics are stuck between this sort of, you know, the vilification of migration and say, oh, but immigration is good, where we're almost washing over a little bit over the fact that a lot of immigration is quite exploitative, relies on extraction of cheap labor, that, you know, we could pay a lot of these jobs better so we wouldn't have people live in cheap housing and, you know, sleep in shifts so they could work in these jobs. Personally, in terms of political landscape, I think there's a really unexploited spectrum where we talk honestly about immigration. And I think the Green Party, in its recent campaigning, has begun to mine that field. I think a lot of people are really unhappy with the way in which immigration is vilified across the board and framed as a legitimate concern, just to tie in on what was said before. I think I might say a little bit more about the channel in the next.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we've already had 3 questions, if you can believe it. And these tie in really nicely to what you were just talking about, which is to do with basically they're kind of a variation on the same theme, which is what do you do in a context where the people who would ordinarily speak out and have an alternative message about migration are finding themselves being silenced or are silent for a variety of reasons. And then what do you do in the context where the state then says, there's no problem with this language, there's no problem with the language of legitimate concerns because people aren't necessarily speaking up. So how do you overcome this? And as one of the people in our audience has said, what does exercising wisdom look like when navigating the tension between harmful technology and respecting people's sense of autonomy and speech? And I think you've probably all got something to say about that, but I'll come to Aaron first.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity. I think to follow along with the issue of both the tension and the legitimate concerns, I think we've for a long time had this idea that, you know, either that immigrants are a benefit or they're a threat. And I think both of those serve a particular capitalist logic that says we need people in an instrumental, exploitative terms, or we don't. And when we don't, it's to, and there poses a threat, it's to actually distract from, austerity, the damage that neoliberalism does, the damage that the actual elite parties who are claiming to fight off the threat of the far right are actually making. And I think it goes to the point that within all this, you also have a developing infrastructure, technological, physical, that surveils, that monitors, that maintains a hostile environment, that feeds a war machine, that then turns against those entering the border, those protesting war, fascism, and genocide. And I think all three aspects serve a particular form of capitalism. It's quite interesting. And I would say racial capitalism, I don't think there's a distinction to be made here. Just as there hasn't been through enslavement, colonialism, historically. But I think one of the interesting things that's going on that is linked very much to the idea of legitimate concerns, is that all of this is being attributed to the working class. Now, sometimes there will be a claim that it's the people, the will of the people, the demos, the white working class left behind becomes something that you can attribute both you can displace the damage that capitalism does to one particular constituency, as well as furnish both a white victim narrative and justify increasing austerity and increasing sort of brutality. I think this is particularly problematic in the way in which you, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it does really often depend on the figure or feature of the far right in the way it is positioned in relation to our democracy, our tolerant liberal democracy. So we would not be racist but for the threat of the far right emerging from the dark depths of our defeat of Nazism, or civil rights in America a little later, apartheid in South Africa. And in order to fight them off, because we know in this narrative that the white working class left behind can't help but be racist. And this is why it's a classist as well as a racist narrative. And we have public opinion surveys to kind of support that. If we're not doing their bidding or the bidding of the far right, then the far right will take to the streets and wreak havoc, as we know they have, or they're going to rise in the election polls and threaten our very democracy, which, AKA they're going to actually threaten the establishment party's chances electorally. And that has created sort of the terms of both mainstreaming, but one in which I think the representation of racist and fascist as the people, and to call them that would be to be sort of like to be classist, whereas I think the classist argument is to represent them as racist, working class as racist. If we don't, you represent these people as the people, and so it's no surprise that migrants are totally dehumanized, and anyone who stands up against it are not considered full people. Traitors if they're citizens, non-humans, or terrorists or extremists.
That's great. Fizza and Alex, have you got anything that you wanted to respond to there before I move on to another topic?
I was just thinking about, sorry, I was jumping there. I was just thinking about, Aaron, your point about the white working class kind of almost being scapegoated themselves as this racist group that is driving the need for these really restrictive immigration policies. And as you said, we are having to react because this group is forcing us to, telling us to. And we know that that's not the case. The language that is coming from the top. Stop the Boats came from Rishi Sunak and the Conservative government, and now it's parroted in these far right marches and in these protests. It's not the other way around interestingly, right? Now we know that kind of there's influencers, fascist influencers out there who have got their sound bites and will be kind of pushing their followers. But it's, yes, this idea that this group being pitted against the other very cleverly in terms of that kind of class politics that is really playing out here is something we need to, again, be very, very mindful of. Also, because there's this attempt to always group the white working class as a distinct group. There's a working class group, right, which is very diverse. It's mixed. It used to include me, it included my parents. We've kind of moved, social mobility is moving us through these classes and these divides. And I think that's something that we need to be really cognizant of when we are having these conversations as well.
Absolutely. And I think the representation of the working class as racist and white is itself part and parcel of this. It denies the working class, which is the most diverse class, and it demonstrates how this narrative is effectively designed to maintain the racial, political, and economic status quo. I mean, I often think about when I first arrived in this country as a migrant myself. People would tell me, because of what I was studying, like, we're the only European country that never elected a far right. And I would always say, but you have a very rich history of mass street mobilizations and mainstream parties doing the work for them, often under the auspices of keeping the far right outside.
I think there's something, sorry to jump in, Alex, I know, Alex, but it's also this idea of what people think is fascism and what is the far right. I mean, empire would be now considered very much far right. What Winston Churchill did with Bengal, and that's far right, like starving people. So I think there's this like shifting of language and kind of ideas. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe if I can kind of, so I absolutely agree with all the points made about the so-called left behind white working class. I think this is an artifice that's mobilized to sort of create an artificial idea of the people that doesn't reflect society as a whole and that serves certain political purposes, that, has raised Robbie Shilliam back the mainstream parties, gotten closer to themselves or met around that idea that there is a group that has been neglected in this country, that's mobilized for specific political purposes. And there's great work that's based all of this. But I also wanted to in on the points about Ukrainians, because I think sometimes the way in which we pit the humanitarian visas that have been provided for Ukrainians against other humanitarian routes in this country, I think that requires almost more of the spectral thinking than the pitting against one another. Because absolutely, we are in a time where all legal routes into the UK have been closed. It's almost become impossible to come to the UK and claim asylum and to not be deported, because any means by which this was possible has been illegalized. And there's a criminalization of asylum and so on, and that is very much targeting people who enter the UK in what has been framed as illegal routes, for instance, by small boats. The fact that we have people crossing in small boats is an effect of immigration politics that have made safer routes inaccessible. So people are risking their lives to come to the UK by traveling on routes that are more dangerous. And these have been also illegalized, and there's a distinctive dehumanization around that immigration route, and asylum is basically undermined in its very nature in this discourse. But I think that there's also a distinctive precarity to the status that has been bestowed upon Ukrainians in the wider European Union, but also in the UK, because yes, obviously they are read as somewhat European and white, and that equips them with distinctive privileges such as, imminent access to welfare, health, education, which has happened across the board in Europe and in the UK. The fact that there has been a distinctive humanitarian route created for them also shows that, people are put into hierarchies around racial narratives. But I think there's also a dynamic of divide and conquer, because the distinctive route that has been created for them relies on private people to host them in their homes, which is, putting a lot of onus onto wider society, creating distinctive precarities for people who rely on their hosts to provide them with a guest room. This is undermining state-based asylum and, things that the state should be providing. The way in which this has been then navigated and the reliance on individual support and so on, we know from statistics that the majority of people work way below their qualifications, so they're not accessing jobs that reflect their skills. So I think what we see here is what Aaron spoke about earlier. There's a sort of distinctive racialization of this group as white and therefore preferred, but on the other hand, also making them available as a cheap labor force that works under their skill set. So I think it's important to pay attention to these hierarchies, but also not say, I wish everybody was treated like Ukrainians, because I really wish the state would provide substantial asylum for everyone, rather than create these temporary routes and substatus and variegated status that then just create greater tension between immigrant communities as well, because everybody is put somewhere on on a different step in the ladder of racial hierarchies.
I think that's lends itself nicely, Alex, to the kind of connection between the narrative and the policies as well, which I think is really important, because I think sometimes we can kind of fall into a trap of just focusing on the narrative and forget about its connection to those broader policies, to the immigration white paper, for example. But the other thing that I think there's a tendency to do, and which I think that, if we just follow the narratives we miss out on, is actually the kind of question about what these narratives and related policies are doing to the individuals and communities who are the intended focus of the narrative. So what are those everyday impacts? So I just wondered, Fizza, what are you seeing in your work at Migrant Rights Network in respect to this?
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing is a lot of, especially now with the current government's focus on think tanks and experts to be kind of speaking to the issues, and not a lot of speaking to those who are directly impacted by everything that we're seeing. What we're seeing is people being quite scared, obviously, by what's happening, not understanding also what is happening, like why, who are the far right. For many people who will have come to the UK, I'm not going to say for all, but some of them will not know what racism looks like on the UK streets. They don't know what the far right are. They don't know what fascism is. This is not language that is commonly used or they're aware of. So there's like a massive kind of almost educating, raising awareness around what is happening and making sure that they understand that this is, even though it's targeted at them, this is not about them. They're not the cause of why we have the far right on our streets at the moment. They're used as this kind of scapegoat. And I think, I mean, there was this really horrific attack on an individual in the West Midlands, and he was attacked by someone who was out and out far right. And his question was, why was I attacked? Right? Not like, I was attacked, how am I going to get justice? It was, why did this person feel that they could do what they did? And that goes back to this, like, helping them to understand that the politics is so divisive, and the government is so geared towards continuing to scapegoat them. They become this really visible target, and that means that on the streets they are the ones that are become the victims, unfortunately. I mean, you're seeing also the protests outside the hotels, the asylum accommodation. And it's just, there's this policy that's been to like visibilize people seeking asylum, where they used to be in our communities, in homes and houses, not kind of obviously corralled in these massive hotels. But they were part of our communities. They were able to kind of go about their days without having to watch over their shoulders. And the previous government, the current government, has really visibilized them and said, if you're going to go after anyone, here's your flashpoints. These are the points to be congregating around, which is can be unbelievably scary. And and I say that I was scared. I mean, I was thinking about whether or how I set foot outside the house last year. Now I've got 2 kids, and I was thinking, do I go here? If I do, what are my exit routes? How am I? I'm thinking about safety constantly, that protection of myself and children. And for people who don't have those connections, like I'm thinking about my community that I can call upon, that don't have those yet, like what do they do? Who do they reach out to? Because you can't rely on the government to protect you. You don't know if the police here will protect you because you've had trauma along the way coming across Europe or in your country of origin. So who do you turn to? What do you do? So I can imagine that the fear being like paramount for a lot of people, and they're also still hopeful that they're going to get to stay, that they're going to get to remain, that they're going to be able to build their lives. So there's like fear / like hope aspect that probably sits within their mindsets the whole time.
There's a brilliant question that's come in, which it kind of takes up this idea of narrative. And it says, what if the intention of the narrative is actually to detract from the policy and its impacts on individuals? And how then, I'm changing the question slightly, but what's the work that needs to be done to challenge that narrative for that particular obfuscation, as well as that kind of macro level that we also talked about around, you know, scapegoating migrants in order to hide some of the ills of austerity, for example. Aaron, I wondered if you had some reflections on that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I mean, I work a lot on narratives, but I think the relationship to policy and the relation to the impact on people's lives is why the study of narratives and why countering those narratives are important. The odd kind of thing for me in my research is because I work on extremism and terrorism, although I should note that I often work on them to highlight their relationship to the mainstream and their position and their function as a scapegoat. And I hate using the term scapegoat for them or for the sort of the kind of the white working class in the way that can be compared as if it's equivalent to the scapegoating of migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees. But because I work on extremism and terrorism, the idea of a narrative and a counter narrative operates radically different in that field, where a narrative is seen as a product of radicalization, disinformation, misinformation, that the sort of the hegemonic kind of construction of reality will counter. So make people realize that they're not aggrieved, that society is very tolerant and welcoming and equal, and capitalism is not bad, you know, and their lot in life is great, you know, and it's so I have a sort of awkward position to countering narratives. I also believe that when it comes to narratives and myths about the threat of migrants, it's hard to counter that because, and I've seen a couple of Vox Pops recently that I've been watching, where someone will say, you know, we have, 10 million migrants are coming in small boats, a year, and someone is shocked and horrified at the number. You ask someone else, you say, well, there's 10,000. That's too much. So we have to see the way in which, I guess, those narratives how they function in mainstreaming, legitimizing particular ideas, particularly when they're linked to alleged, public opinion survey and stats that are used as a subjective metric of what can and should be done politically. But what ends up happening is, if you keep on solidifying this, there becomes this sort of hardened kind of core to sort of saying these people have no right to be here, to be considered to be here, to exist. And in a sense, it's hard to counter that when, going back to the sort of the idea of the hegemonic narrative, as has been said before, all major parties are towing the exact same line. So the dominant narrative, the hegemonic narrative that would normally be used to counter extremism, radicalization, and racism is racism, radicalizing, and the product of mainstreaming. And I think that puts us in a very, very dangerous situation, a situation where, you know, people don't just, and then it's to refer back to what Fizza said, it's not just that they're under threat on the streets, which is typically how the far right has operated. And racism has been recognized. You know, it's operated far more systemically, institutionally, and structurally. But there is no one effectively to turn to say there's no sense of security. And I know Fizza's already said this, but we now have a situation where the far right is on the street saying there's two-tier policing, when we know policing, you know, is part and parcel of institutional systemic racism and the management of the sort of the everyday border and hostile environment. So the far right is operating on the street in what I would call sort of, you know, extrajudicial, legal and legitimate violence. And it's an interesting thing in light of my research, where I've looked at the way the far right has been seen as a scapegoat for racism. It can become the foot soldiers or the scapegoat for the system's racism. Now everyone's working in conjunction and in cooperation, and that is an extremely dangerous thing for both people who are migrantized or racialized on the street in their everyday lives, in their workplaces, in the public services, or using those public services or private services, but also I think for the nation, for the country, and for the wider population, because it is a creeping fascism.
Yeah, totally. I think I completely agree with Aaron that it's a really watery territory in terms of pushing back on narratives. I think if we're going to meet the critique of immigration at eye level and push back by countering the arguments, then we've already lost the struggle. So my strategy most recently has been, you know, something I've learned from decolonial perspectives, is to point to much longer histories of extractivism, of instrumentality. The history of immigration management in Britain has always been instrumental, has always followed economic rationalities of openings and closures depending on what was considered to be most useful for the economy, and that relied on the extraction of cheap labor from various parts of the world. And I think we need to make these histories more visible and show the exploitative nature of immigration, rather than end up in this sort of ping pong of is immigration good or is immigration bad? Because people have always moved. There's just the history of Britain is one of various different people settling here and different people invading, and Britain itself has expanded quite violently, right, beyond its so-called natural boundaries. Just anecdotally, the natural boundaries, my father, outlaw, is taking a course in Polish history, and he's sent me his materials where he's learning about this history. And so the first page, I only looked at the first page, and that said, Poland, unlike the UK, has got no natural boundaries. And you sort of thought, Britain didn't take its natural boundaries that seriously in several hundred years of colonial history. So I think we shouldn't cede ground on pointing to the complexities of immigration. I think there's so much evidence, and we have had decades of evidence of the benefits of immigration, the naturalness of immigration, but we also need to point to the darker sides. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
I should say there are loads and loads of questions coming in. I will try to get round to some of them, but I don't think that I'm going to get round to all of them. But there is one kind of point that keeps coming up, which is to do with the relationship between the kind of silencing of kind of anti-immigration protests and silencing around Israel and Palestine, particularly around Gaza and Palestine. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of reflect on that connection, because I think that there is a connection there, really, isn't there, in line with some of the things that have already been said around fascism, for example, around freedom of speech, those kinds of things. So opening up to whoever wants to go first. No one wants to go first. Aaron, go.
Yeah, I mean, it just happens that I'm working on a project about that, something about those relationships right now. I think there's absolutely a connection. I think and I mean, you could have a really long list of the factors, and I'm sure if I listed them, everyone would recognize them, or almost everyone, critically. But I think what we've seen is, and I think it follows from Alex's point about counter narratives. I mean, one of the problems we have is that if you say the white working class need another, they need to, we need to recognize their grievances as legitimate, even from a sort of left-wing perspective. You're legitimizing the narrative. If you do the longer history about, you're absolutely, what you're doing is you're performing for them the threat of wokeness. And that's not saying you don't do it, but they have an ability to formulate everything, not just far right, the right and the centrists have a way of contorting every argument and every bit of phenomenon into a particular economy. And so the reason I'm saying that is because we see the very different ways in which far-right mobilizations, racist riots, are treated as legitimate, as has already been said. And even when there's violence against the police, so it's not even violence against counter protesters from the left, anti-racist or anti-fascist movements, because those are seen as equal to or more of a threat. They're constructed as an equal threat, but they're represented and they're seen by society as a much more of a threat to the status quo in the system. But we see something very different when we look at pro-Palestinian protests, which are constructed largely as extremist and terrorist supporting from the get-go, with possibly some good apples, as opposed to the far right ones, which have some bad apples. That's a very different, that's much like the idea of white working class racism and extremism is seen as or even male incel grievance and violent misogyny is seen as something that we need to sympathize, empathize with, and support. Whereas Muslims are treated like a suspect community for the act of one person. These are radically different asymmetrical relationships. But the thing is that the pro-Palestinian anti-genocide protests are also seen as evidence of left wokeism, anti-patriotism, and a threat to the nation, the product of migration, the product of what referred to as Islamicization. There's so many ways in which these protests are represented in asymmetrical ways that is completely the opposite of their power in society and the threat they pose. Human rights and stopping racist colonial violence is seen as an evidence of extremism, where pogroms in the street are represented as the will of the people. This is quite shocking, but it also comes on the back of a period where post Black Lives Matter and COVID, there has been this ramping up of anti-protest legislation that has disproportionately targeted, like counter-terrorism and counter-extremism, particular communities and particular sets of politics, which are the same targets of the far right, which is being let off the hook. And when the far right is dealt with by the system or the state, they are treated as a redeemable problem, bad apples, or convenient, as I said before, convenient scapegoats, so that the system can look fair and equal. We saw this, and I think this was all revealed with the Shawcross review, where Prevent and its supporters were patting themselves on the back for saying, look, we're all equal now, we're going after the far right. And then immediately it was like, yeah, but how can you tell the far right from the mainstream? Which is, saying the quiet part loud.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things that brings up, one of which is to do with where's the accountability at the moment. which I think is a kind of a question that we might want to kind of level in respect to thinking about what the role of politicians should actually be within this and how and what they are and aren't doing. But there's also a question of whose lives matter, or whose lives can be dehumanized and whose can't, that I think is kind of important in kind of thinking across both the kind of, you know, why a protest about Palestine can't be recognized publicly in the newspaper in the same way as a protest by a far smaller group of people who are far right extremists can be. So I just wanted to kind of solicit some reflections on both of those dimensions. This kind of this sense of where's the accountability, but also like whose lives are lives, who is allowed to live in this context, and how is that connected to not only the narratives but the policies that are being implemented, the pushbacks in the channel, for example, or you know, or whether we call what's happening in Gaza a genocide, for example.
Can I maybe comment on this? Because I think, I mean, I want to maybe articulate a sort of very small sign of hope on this, because I do think that the way in which anti-genocide protests have been policed, for instance, and organizations have been banned, and this kind of pushback on this has really unified a lot of the left, because it was so ridiculous in some of the attempts, right? Who was arrested at these protests and so on, and these images that we saw of old people being carried off the street. The demonization of immigration is beginning also to flip, I think, in opinion polls. And, you know, I think a lot of people are just not happy with the fact that this is just the only thing that everybody always draws on as the big problem that needs addressing, and that we can't talk about alternatives to, you know, public services, the NHS, that this is never an issue, that all major parties drone on about immigration. I think the mainstream parties are kind of losing ground because a lot of people are losing jobs. The amount of conversations I've had with colleagues who've lost their job in the academy because so many people have been laid off, but the same I'm having with people who work for various charities, for, you know, in so many sectors. Currently, people are losing jobs. I think we have a real potential here for alternative mobilization that the mainstream parties are just not catering to at all. I think that explains the surge to the Green Party, that explains the people are rallying behind the new, you know, Your Party, as it's currently called. And I do think this will eventually backfire. I don't think this will just be a spiral of repression. I mean, you know, putting that out there, I most of the time I'm depressed about it, but I have a sense that people won't take this line down.
I like that you've got that hope in you. I think one thing that I wanted to kind of bring in was, well, just the accountability, but just on Gaza, for example, there in the migration and refugee sector, which is where Moran sits, there's definitely a lack of willingness to talk about the geopolitics of why people move, right? Or why people are forced to move. And it came really late. Like people were suddenly, oh, no, we need safe routes for Palestinians. And it's like, we've always needed safe routes for Palestinians. Palestinians pre-7th of October needed safe routes as well. And we haven't had them. And again, the same, but it's like certain groups will get put into those really deserving categories, right? Like Afghan women and girls, right? Because the Taliban is the biggest boogeyman at the moment, if it's not Putin. And this idea that, okay, it's you know, it's very divorced. It's very weird. It's like migration policy kind of sits separately in the UK. Like it's just policies and systems, right? It's not linked to the relationships the UK government will hold with X state, right? Like, or doesn't hold, for example. And I think it then, I mean, so yeah, there's this kind of weird notion here around like, it's all separate, right? So we don't speak to why people are kind of protesting around why we need safe routes for Palestinians, for example, and like you will hear like silence in the migration and refugee sector. But kind of, I also want to bring it back to that kind of accountability aspect around the politicians at the moment who are very much spouting disinformation. They are spouting lies in Parliament and then in the media and getting away with it. I mean, there's like very little questioning of it. And we had this not too long ago where there was someone who was talking about, you know, they're going to come here, the people come here on the boats, and they're going to live in the hotels for the rest of their lives. Where in the, like, at what point could anyone live for the rest of their lives in a hotel? I mean, it's not, I mean, hopefully never feasibly possible for anyone, because that's not a life to live. But I mean, that lie is told in Parliament, it's then amplified, and it's not held to account. And I went to a public event where there was 2 MPs on a panel, and I asked the question. I said, we keep on talking about accountability for the media, we talk about accountability for everyone else, but we don't talk about accountability for politicians. At what point can we call out, or should we be calling out politicians as liars? One of the MPs was like, oh, no, we can't do that. We'll just have fights in Parliament where we're calling each other liars. And the other MP was like, but the MPs shouldn't be lying. I mean, it's like, we wouldn't call you a liar if you weren't lying. But there seems to be like a space where a politician, whether it's Farage, whether it's Starmer, stuff will trip off the tongues. And there is the kind of the threat and the reactions that come from that. There is no accountability for the fact that, like, we've got Unite the Kingdom rallies because of the narratives that have been put in place, or the policies, I would say some of the policies that are also have come off the back of some of these narratives. Absolutely nothing. There's complete silence. Like it's all created in a vacuum. It was created over here, and then, you know, it's manifested over there as a protest in front of asylum accommodation. And that's what's really frustrating to me at the moment, that anyone can say anything at the moment around migrants, and because it has been very much deliberately removed from the idea of talking about migration as being also thinly veiled racism or racism, it's very easy to do, right? You can talk till the cows come home about how migration is bad, this is bad, migrants are doing X, Y, Z, without consequence, essentially, at the moment, and no pushback on actually, well, what is bad about migration exactly?
So I think that there's another actor within this as well that's kind of come up, but we've skirted around, which is the media, and the role of the media within this. And I just realised, Alex and Aaron, you've both kind of turned your mics on with the hope of coming in on that point, on around accountability, I assume. But I wondered if you could also bring in any reflections that you've got on the media and that sense of accountability. So whichever of you would like to go first.
Yeah, I think about the. I think that follows really nicely from the lying. If something can follow nicely from lying, it's interesting, and I think it does apply to also the issue of Gaza, in the way we in our research, in my research with Aurélien Mondon, we talk about the way in which mainstreaming is often predicated on the construction of the far right as this kind of outlier in a tolerant, peaceful, kind of liberal, post-racial settlement, and building on the work of sort of Eduardo Silva and others. And one of the interesting things about that is I believe that partly where the far right kind of gained traction is by sort of constructing, particularly in an attempt to get away from their kind of fascist kind of history, is through narratives of populism and the white working class and things like that, but also finding targets who they could deny their racial status of. So migrants or Muslims, and making it about their kind of illiberal culture. And the centrists and the mainstream right have also adapted to this. And this is why one of the things we start to see, even though we see, like, you can't say anything about society, cancel culture, this, wokeness, that. And what's ended up happening is if you're on the right and you're racist, you can say about anything you want. You can say anything you want about migrants, about Muslims, about Palestinians, And in that way, if you protest any of that, if you protest genocide, you're accused of all sorts of things, of extremism, supporting terrorism, anti-Semitism, and you are placed in a position where, you know, in some cases, you've seen organizations proscribed. You've seen absolute crackdowns on university campuses and on city streets and in the media, whereas the narrative that supports the genocide, that supports crackdowns on migrants, that actually emboldens and enables pogroms, which are often called protests, riots, are actually, like, anything that criticizes that are accused of classism, of anti-Semitism, of used to be wokeness, or whatever, of a lack of patriotism. And I think the media has an absolute responsibility for that, because the media, which was never left-wing, let's say, was never anti-racist, also bought into this myth that they were liberal and elitist. And they walked right into and actually helped with editorial kind of decision-making to platform far-right narratives, racist narratives, far-right figures and racist, such that you have a position now where you go on Question Time and there's no one left of center. I mean, they put someone on Labor in as if they're left of center. And then we're starting to see some movement with the Greens. And while I do have hope, I think one of the hopes lies is in there are mass mobilizations against racism, fascism, and genocide. But until that is recognized by the media and by elites as the will of some people, it can't counter the absolute dominance of the other side's narrative about the will of the people being against all of this.
Yeah, that I really welcome this, because it sets me up nicely to what I wanted to say, to the role of the media, but also the sort of, you know, who these far-right people actually are. Because if I was to comment on what's happening on the coast, where people arrive in small boats, then the far-right presence there is a group of very few individuals who have, I will say this, although this is being recorded, who have questionable intelligence. Some of them cannot get a whole sentence straight, and yet various media outlets in this country regularly rock up and hold a mic into their faces because they are seen to embody the so-called left behind white working class. So I find this really, really infuriating, because of the sort of the very small number of people who are engaged in this type of activism, and the extreme amplification that they're receiving as articulating something that reflects the will of the people, because there is no such thing. I mean, the coastal population is very much, shall we say, some people really have still not noticed what's going on. A few people observe those who are patrolling the beaches in the name of, you know, defending the island. But there's also a huge, you know, a huge presence of people who show solidarity, who do welcome teams when boats arrive, who hand out blankets. There are rapid response teams in places like Hastings, who, you know, are really concerned about the fact that people have to attempt a journey in cold waters and so on. And yet, when do they get a mic held into their face, right? We so much more get to hear about the people who are protesting this, although they're such a small, completely disorganized group. They're in and out of prison, which is a contradiction in itself. The amount of times they have been arrested and then released again after a short while is unfathomable to me. But, you know, I think it's also empirically really important to pay attention to how well networked they are. They have access to the highest echelons of power. When we interviewed some of these people, it was Tory MPs who gave us the phone number of one of these people, one of these 3, 4, 5 people, right? So so I think there's almost like an instrumentalization of these concerns for political purposes that the media plays a big role in. But I think that has led to emboldening them in a way that we're now beginning to feel more and more. I think they're getting They're getting more violent. They're getting bigger in numbers. The fact that we've had, the biggest far-right march in British history just a few weeks ago, at which Elon Musk appeared and openly appealed to people to engage in violent action, because he did say, violence will come to you, we need to fight back. So there's open incitement to violence here. So I think the genie is a little bit out of the bottle, but both the media and the mainstream parties have got a lot to answer for in amplifying what started off as quite a small group of people.
Can I just come in?
Oh, a very quick final thought. Immigration politics, also very responsible. If you think back, the hostile environment, the prevent duty, and what the Tories tried with the Project Kraken, all responsibilize the population, right? They ask ordinary people to act as border guards, to check people's documents, to watch out for signs of radicalization, to detect people who might be illegally in the country. I think this is also a breeding ground for vigilantism and for the far right, because everybody suddenly has to think about, potential suspects in their ultimate vicinity. So I think that's got a lot to answer for as well in making people particularly vigilant.
No, I think that's a really good point. It's like it's on the onus is on us all to be watching who our neighbors. A bit similar to what's happening in the USA right now with ICE and the way that it's in just in neighborhoods and taking over. I was just going to bring in around the media. I think there's also just something to caveat is, please don't think that this is just like far-right owned media or those fringe media outlets that we know are all out there. But actually there is mainstream media that is enabling a lot of the language as well. So we could name them whatever, but I have interestingly, you put comments, as we get asked to put comments in, and it'll be really interesting to see what are called left-wing media outlets will put in. I mean, they tend to omit the word racism. And actually, when we've been asked for comment from right-wing media, which has been unusual to receive those requests, would use the whole quote, including racism, whether it's to stir up their vote, the readers or whatever. But it was like, oh, actually, we were allowed to name that it's systemic racism, or this is the underlying issue for this policy, whatever. Whereas you won't see that in the left wing. And you will also see, again, this idea of like legitimate concerns coming up quite often in so-called left-wing media outlets. So I think there is a lot of educating to do of the media, a lot of work to do with editors. I mean, I don't think it's the journalists, and speaking to some of them, they're like, I don't know why, but they're not taking that story forward. It's the editors. How can we get to the editors to help them understand that framing the story in that way isn't helpful? For example, like, do you always need to know the nationality of a person for a story? It's unnecessary. It was an individual. But like, again, there's this kind of, I don't know whether it's just, this is how journalism has always been, and therefore we continue as it is, rather than thinking, how can we be also part of this pushback against the far right and far right narratives kind of like seeping into our professions and our work? I don't feel like there is enough being done around that as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to do on that. That kind of tackling disinformation starts with absolutely everyone. I don't think we should presume that because a journalist is going out there and going to tell a story, that they actually understand the root causes and the issues surrounding whatever the story is that they're going to write about.
I think oh, sorry, where's the feedback coming from? I think that really helps to kind of move us on to the final part of the conversation, which is about the work that needs to be done now. And of course, some of this is also about the conditions under which we're working right now. And I think we've kind of outlined or sketched around some of the kind of the issues that we're facing right now. So, but before we move into kind of thinking about some kind of alternatives that we might want to kind of put forwards, and thinking about how we can support one another in that kind of work, Fizza, I did just want to hear from you about how what's been happening over the last couple of years has impacted on the work that you do within Migrant Rights Network, and what you know of what's happening elsewhere in the kind of migrant and refugee sector?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing, you kind of made a plug for Words Matter at the beginning. Thank you for that. And it was very much like a narrative campaign. It was, here's language that is being used, and here's an explainer to help you understand the problems with that language, with that phrasing, with that word, whether it's just plain wrong or whether it's rooted in racism or colonialism, etc. And now we've kind of gone, right, it's not about narrative, it's countering disinformation. So we've also had to move and shift in terms of what we do and how we do it. And when I say countering disinformation, I'm not like, here we go with facts and stats, and because we know that stats at the moment are not penetrating. It doesn't matter whether you tell someone they're only 1% of the population, it does not penetrate, because what their reality is sat somewhere else. It is about us thinking also about that political education. It's really understanding through our own lived experience, our power and privilege, why we hold certain language, why we still use certain language, whether it's because we've just got attuned to these stereotypes and tropes about migrants in certain ways, or just because the framing of migration has been in this way. So for us, it's been about very much like, we need to have conversations, and some of those are going to be difficult conversations around migration. One thing that we are going to be very clear on is we're not going to ask migrants, migratized and racialized people to have some of those really difficult conversations with racists. That's something that we are not here to kind of enable. What we want is allies to step up and have those difficult conversations. Just as I want to be that ally for the trans and queer community to say homophobia and transphobia, that's my job to step in and challenge. I think there's the other aspects is really about building that community. So a lot of work that's being done in and around the edges that we're part of is about community self-defense. It's about sharing intelligence, information, knowledge, like how do we counter what is going to be mobilized maybe on the streets? Like how do we get word to the people in the asylum accommodation that there's going to be a protest in the area? How do you how can we make sure that they keep themselves safe as well, while we can't be physically present all the time? So there's a lot of things, I think. And then I think just finally, I want to say, I think we've got to a point where we've got to stop the far right defining the narratives. At the moment, it's very much they are determining what and how, what we respond to, what we react to. And I think we need to kind of pull back and say, actually, what do we want to be put out there as well for ourselves? So, and I'm not saying that's going into, in our Words Matter campaign, you will see like we don't use the language of, oh, migrants contribute and all that's because, again, this is, again, pandering to deserving groups. But actually, like, how do we push back and say, actually, just some of what you're spouting is racist? It's very simple, and actually calling it what it is. There's great work being done by lots of other organizations as well, and I will put some in the chat. But I think that we need to collectively politically educate ourselves, as well as our communities, but also migrants and racialized people who are coming into this space going, I don't know what's going on, who are also then going down this very common route of like, but I'm better than, and I pay taxes and I contribute, and are kind of going into that, hitting themselves off other groups because, well, that's the easiest way to kind of gain empathy for yourselves. And it's gonna ramp up with the immigration white paper proposals. We're seeing it already, where people say, oh, but indefinite leave to remain shouldn't apply to me, let it apply to everyone else who comes in, right? Like it's for them, not for us, and not for me. And having to speak to those people and say, but okay, well, what happens in this scenario where someone's got an application in, but they haven't yet set foot in the UK? What are you going to do then? Does it apply to them? Does it? And helping them to navigate actually that again, that just, I guess, being quite, that sounds really rude, but selfish in this situation isn't the best course of action. Actually, if we're collectivizing and pushing back against all these policies together, which is, again, let's name your common enemy here, the Home Office, whatever it is, that's a better opportunity rather than kind of going down our siloed campaigning routes and carving out kind of winnable campaigns for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point about how we establish the ground for migrant solidarity, both between between those communities, but also between allies and communities. But I also wanted to bring you in, Aaron, here as well, because of course this is not really the first time that this has happened. It would be a mistake to believe that the current moment is the first time we've seen this in the UK or in the world. And are there lessons that we can learn from the ways that we've approached these issues previously that can be brought forwards?
Yeah, I'm afraid they're never learned. I hope this is a turning point. But something I'm often saying at events on sort of like countering hate or countering extremism and counter-terrorism, because I've tended to reject the problem-solving model, which I find is very sort of like the analysis is instrumental and it's very much kind of like hegemonic and reasserting the status quo. Is I'm like, that's all fine and well to be problem solving. I'm not just a critic, but at the end of the day, the solutions aren't working and the problems are getting worse. And what I like to think of the way in we treated this issue is either migrants are the problem or the far right's the problem, or both, but migrants are more of a problem because they cause the far right. And that's the kind of the way it's kind of gone. And I often think, maybe because I like alliteration, but the response to this problem has often been like counter-extremism, counter-terrorism, centrism, compromise, or the construction of equivalence between bad actors on both sides. And I think that this kind of shows also why racism and the far right are so valuable to the system, because it's always about maintaining the status quo. And I think this occurs in several ways. I was like, it's also why those four guys on the coast don't matter, because it's actually about their function, the function of that ecosystem, the function of the symbolic function of working class grievance or far right extremists or whatnot. But that I think what ends up happening with all the approaches we've seen historically is that we center the perpetrator, we center the sort of the angry racist or the far right or the aggrieved young man, and we center democracy or liberal democracy in the system as the sort of the vulnerable victim of all of this. And what ends up happening is that we don't have solutions that center the migrant, that center the actual target of this. And I would also argue you can't protect liberal democracy by dehumanizing and denigrating and failing to represent the target of this racism, hate, and scapegoating. And I think there needs to be much more victim-centered solutions. And it's funny because in a criminal justice discourse, victim-centered is often reactionary, but no one will ever center in these the actual victims of those kind of right-wing reactionary politics. I think we have to center them in our solutions, in our knowledge, in our strategies, and we also have to. I think we have to stop. We need campaigners, we need politicians, we need an actual alternative to the status quo, which I think we're starting to see from Greens and others. But I also think that we need to think also about showing up, so people know that they're cared for and they're supported and they mean something. And it can't just be street warrior activism. There has to be a real human face and human interaction with it.
I was just going to come in and say, absolutely, Aaron. I think the centering the migrant voices is essential at the moment. A lot of the work we do is actually making sure that they're asked what their opinions are on policies and what the recommendations they would like to make that change. Like, you know, if we are going to go in and offer evidence to the government about the impact of something, the recommendations are coming from them as well. And I think that there's too much emphasis at the moment on think tanks and polls and others driving what the change should be, if there is change at all, or what the recommendations are. And the final point I wanted to kind of bring in is just that offering alternatives. I think that's something that we don't do enough of. We are very much having to react, and I understand that. So you go in with reformist policies, right? I'm not talking about reform the political party, but just policies that you say, well, if we tweak this around the edges, it will be slightly better than what it is now, but still harmful, right? Like, and I think the whole time limit for detention is a really good example of a reformist policy, which is seen as this winnable campaign. You've got, you know, people on both sides of the party saying, yes, we should have a 28-day time limit. But what they're still doing is legitimizing detention. They're still saying criminalize people for having moved across a border, whatever, by whatever means. Or, and I think it's this appeasement that people have, and this desire to win something now, right? That drives a lot of this idea that we need to just tweak with the systems that we have now. Whereas, why aren't we trying to create the alternative? Let's dismantle them. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen overnight. And that's about playing the long-term game and thinking, it may not happen in my lifetime. I know it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but actually thinking about those alternative futures which don't have the systems of oppression that we have now, essentially. Can we all start visioning a bit better? And that doesn't mean we take our eye off the ball and have those incremental changes and win, and, you know, now, but just start thinking a bit differently to what we have now.
So I agree with all of this. I suppose I've got two very minor things to add in terms of things that can be done and where it's worth directing our energies towards. So my experience with, for instance, these various policy initiatives that the Conservative government has tried to push through that were just in contradiction to international law, they were all challenged in court. So Rwanda was challenged in court. They had a pushback policy which was challenged in court by 4 different organizations. So most recently, the courts have actually upheld a lot of principles that governments were quite ready to get rid of. So, you know, I think there's a lot of crowdfunding campaigns that are worth supporting, because legal action is one of those few areas where a lot of this can still be pushed back, as long as the UK is in the, you know, has not exited the Convention of Human Rights, as the Conservative government, the Conservative not government, thankfully, but, you know, although thankfully, shall we say thankfully, because the current government is on this issue, not really doing much different stuff. And the other thing I think is a presence in these sorts of critical zones. You know, as somebody who's worked on the coast and on small boat crossings, I would say it does make a huge difference that people are there when the far right show up to an arrival, but there are people say, welcome, you know, can we do anything for you? That does make a difference. So there are great organizations that show solidarity there. There's also organizations that do monitoring around the channel and hold the government to account, such as, for instance, the former Channel Rescue and current Channel Monitoring Project, where there is a sort of meticulous documenting of perhaps, you know, human rights breaches, but also of policy and its implications and the reality on the ground. So I think we need to sort of nurture our hope, but we can't just take that from, you know, reading the newspaper. I think if everybody did a little something, that would make a difference.
I think there's so much more that we could discuss, but I'm very aware that we've got 5 minutes left until the close. And I just wanted to invite you, and apologies to everybody who's put a question into the chat. Over the last, well, since we've been running these, I've never seen so many questions in the chat. So I'm sorry if we didn't quite get round to all of them. but I hope some of the discussion has helped to respond to some of that. There's a kind of a big theme coming through that's around silence, silences, silencing, that obviously connects, you know, what's happening to some activists, what's happening to some academics, whether that's in respect to these issues around migration, whether it's in respect to Palestine, for example, that I think we could have reflected on a little bit more, but we just don't have time this evening. I just wanted to kind of close by saying thank you very much to Fizza, Alex and Aaron for joining me this evening, and to our Senior Events Officer, Danielle Galway, for her work in making this happen and the technical support that she's provided this evening. Danielle will definitely be in touch with you if she hasn't been already, to ask you for your feedback on this event. And please do fill that in and kind of provide us with any feedback, positive or critical, that you have, so that we can reflect on it and build that into our future planning. And last but not least, thank you to those of you who've joined us this evening. It's been great to see so many of you. As I said, fantastic to see so many questions. And I will take some of the questions that remain unanswered, and we'll see what we can do. No promises. We'll see what we can do with those when we reply to you. As you know, the Sociological Review and Migrant Rights Network are charitable organisations. If you would care to make a donation to either organisation, we'll make sure those links are put into that correspondence that we send around. And as far as I know, the next conversation will be in January, and it will be on the topic of reproductive justice. But you never know. From time to time, we just introduce something at the last minute, as we did with this event, particularly if it's something that we think is particularly topical and needs discussing. To find out about everything that's going on at the Sociological Review Foundation, you can sign up to our newsletter. And please do, when that email comes around asking you to fill out the feedback form, we'd really, really appreciate it. But thank you all very, very much. And I'm really, really sorry that we couldn't go on for much longer, but I suspect everyone either needs to go to bed or get some dinner at this stage. So yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.